Thank you for your patience. We will now begin the parallel session 3A. The session will be moderated by Mr. Nicolas Bouchot, advisor to the Dean and T7 Japan, ADBI. Mr. Bouchot, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon or good morning if you are following us from online. This session is devoted to sharing some results and thoughts of a very new task force in the T7 called Peace, Security, and Global Governance. And I'm very grateful from the co-chairs of the task force, Jenny Gordon from Australia, Saeed Munir Kasru from Bangladesh, and Antonio Villafranca from Italy to have joined the discussion alongside Yoichi Mine, the Executive Director of JICA Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development, and also Professor Doshisha University in Tokyo. Thank you very much. Kyoto, I say Tokyo, sorry, in Kyoto, right? So thank you very much for also contributing to the discussion today. How we have organized the session is rather simple. We will have a number of insights, starting with Saeed Munir Kasru, and then Jenny Gordon and Antonio Villafranca, and then Yoichi Mine. And the work in the task force has explored a range of issues, a wide range of issues, maybe the widest range of issues in the whole of the T7, ranging from post-conflict peacekeeping to nation building, economic recovery, and other aspects of peacemaking, peace building, including questionings about multilateral organizations, the state of the rule of law, and traditional and non-traditional security threats in the cyber age, just to give you a brief hints of the complexity and intertwining of the issues that this task force had to address. Thankfully, all of the co-chairs and the experts which were involved all have experience in the G7, in the G20, and in the management of think tanks, government positions, and complex international negotiations. That's also probably why at some point you agreed to join the T7 Japan on those matters. So with this, we have 1 hour and 10 minutes together. People online, if you have observation questions, please share them, right? So through the chat. And I will pass it on to Saeed for a few opening words. If this gets too lengthy, or if I feel that we do not have time, I will do like that. So don't worry, the mic works, but we better take advantage of sitting together this afternoon. Saeed, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again for joining.
Thank you very much, Nikolai, for the kind introduction, and thanks to ADBI for having kindly invited to not only co-chair this task force, also participating. And it has been a pleasure and privilege to work with my very esteemed colleagues, Jenny, Antonio, and of course the rest of the ADBI team. As Nikolai has very correctly mentioned, the whole concept of security has gone through a paradigm shift in last 10-15 years. So I'll try to simplify the complex and try to set the context of today's discussion. We know the last little more than a decade, this whole happy merry-go-round of globalization, free trade, multilateralism has received a pushback. And we have seen as much more than 1 billion people came out of poverty during globalization and so on. A lot of people were left out. And many people who lost jobs, lost economic opportunities, found their voices through a lot of new generation leaders, whether it's Donald Trump in US or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Erdogan in Turkey. So huge rise of populism And that automatically led to a lot of inward-bound political reorientation, whether it was Donald Trump's America First or Bolsonaro cutting down trees in Amazon because that was more important than climate issues, so on and so forth. And that still continues. So first level of security comes in the geopolitical level, where a lot of seismic changes have happened. So the question is, when we reboot multilateralism, and we try to move to post-pandemic era, what are the overall security compass that we're facing? I'll touch base on few fundamental issues. We know as we were trying to come out of the COVID pandemic era and hoping to move to post-pandemic, unfortunately, we were struck with the Ukraine war. And we know what has happened since then. Food, energy prices have shot up, supply chains have been disrupted, and many developing countries have been very hardly hit by the high import cost and also inflationary pressure. And we have seen countries like Sri Lanka going literally bankrupt. So a lot of things have dramatically changed. And it has had this trickle-down effect. For example, if I look at food security, even as we speak, about more than 380 million people are food insecure. And almost 1 million people are fighting hunger in famine-like situation. And 75% of people who are hungry, not surprisingly, are in war-torn region, which is further worsened by the climate-related crop loss and livelihood. One. Then, talking about climate, whether it's flood in Pakistan or the heat wave sweeping in Australia or Europe, or the famine and drought in Africa, this is taking a heavy human toll. And the target we have set in Paris, 1.5, or the net zero, we are still struggling with that. So this continues to be a big challenge. Then moving to the digital platform, true that during the pandemic, the world saw a huge jump in digital platforms, and internet penetration growth, which was about 6-7% before the pandemic, jumped to 17 to 20%. So we had telemedicine, we have medical services, we had e-learning, e-commerce, so on and so forth. But what also is equally true, half of the world's population almost do not have internet connection. And if we don't bridge this digital divide, the socio-economic uptake will have serious consequences. So that is something, another risk and security that we are facing. Gender is an important factor. Even as we speak, 1 out of 3 women in the world, once in their life, have faced some kind of physical abuse. And although the original target was gender parity will be achieved by 2030, we are far behind that. And going by today's pace, it will take another 200-250 years to sort of have gender parity. So a lot of these issues are very connected, interrelated. So the whole concept of security has taken a dramatic shift. It's not longer that you have the most advanced weaponry and a very strong military and you're the most secure nation in the world. And look into the cyberspace, we have seen how sitting in a remote corner in some part of Europe, you can strike in Australia, or sitting somewhere in some remote corner of South America, the whole cyber world. So all these issues is making life quite complicated. And having said that, one of the things that we saw in the morning opening plenary, this whole connectivity between G7 and G20, what they can do. And as I remarked in that session, while the geopolitics and politics is always complex in nature, and on one hand, we have 7 industrialist democracies, which are also part of G20. On the other hand, we have G20, which are different, a mix and match. We have countries which are not necessarily democratic, but have common. So we at our task force looked into those dimensions, and my Jenny and Antonio will sort of share more insight on the economic aspect and the Washington consensus. But the G7, G20, as I said also in the morning, it's easier to focus on some of the areas they can work on, which is reviving multilateralism, rebooting, and then also finding ways of doing trade without harming the environment, rebooting SDG, which is hanging by the thread, then also finding sustainable development goal. And these are some of the things where G7, G20 can synergize. And we have seen a struggle. Last year, it was Indonesia struggling to find a joint communique. This year, the onus is on India. So it would be good to have more political dialogue, more working room between the two powerful blocs, so that instead of a confrontational path, there are more ways to come together, so that out of these two, because G20 represents 80% of global GDP, unfortunately 80% of global emission as well. So we don't have any option but other than to make these two powerful blocs find a way to find some common ground so the rest of the world can see ray of hope. So this would be my very initial sort of insights into some of the fundamental security issues that we are facing, and as far as G7, G20, how to bring it together. But I'll be very looking forward to hearing from my other speakers as well as answering to any interception from the floor. I hope, Nicola, I've done it before your time.
Oh, that's very fine. Then, thanks to that, I've got a quick question that might also be then further elaborated on by Jenny, Antonio, and also our colleague. Is what was maybe the most challenging in the task force? Because you said there were those different issues, etc. So I'm not saying among you, but I mean in terms of finding a way, organizing ideas, then also selecting the papers and etc. What was the most difficult articulation? Like, is it G7 versus or in G20, or is it like you mentioned these different food security, cyber security, or was it linked with these different notions, sometimes a bit fuzzy, of security, or was it linked to considering this sort of historic transformations, Washington consensus that is over, etc., in other ways? What was the most compelling issue you had to deal with so as to find a way and have a say about these peace, security, and global governance?
I wish Dean Sonobe was here. Oh, he's there. Okay. That's a fair question. I think when you put these three words next to each other, peace, security, governance, it itself tells you the challenge me and my colleagues faced. They complement, they also conflict with each other. So our challenge was twofold. One, on our intellectual level, what are the sort of groundwork, history we have to sort of find out or make some recommendation which would be workable. Secondly, because of the inherent nature of these three key things, security, peace, governance, at times we were struggling that, okay, fine, this is what came out in one of the declarations, but in ground, the reality was very different. So how do we mix and match? So how do we put some recommendations to the leadership, which will hopefully, in terms of giving the options to choose from, will sail through the different channels. So that was one of the intellectual challenges we faced. Coming to the second part, when we looked around, there's so many things happening in such a short time in last 2-3 years. And given the word limit and other thing we have, we had to struggle in terms of what to keep, what not to keep, how to prioritize. But I'm very grateful to, of course, to two of my colleagues that round of intense exchange of ideas, debates, ultimately, hopefully lead to fruition of a paper which will hopefully help both the ADBI and the leadership level to make. So it was both, and I mean, life is no fun without challenges. So it was challenging, but was as well as equally intellectually rewarding.
Thank you very much, Said. Jenny, I'm turning to you. The issue paper, for those who are listening and might not be familiar, the issue papers, each task force, such as this one, has monitored the production of 4 policy briefs, right? And also agreed to produce what we call the issue paper. That is a note that might be linked to the findings of the policy briefs, but it is also the expertise of the co-chairs themselves, along with the knowledge and other engagements. And your issue paper, you have entitled it Building Comprehensive Global Security, Harnessing the Unexplored G7, G20 Synergies. So, Jenny, the floor is yours. And maybe what would be then those unexplored G7, G20 synergies, and maybe there are some other areas you would like to specifically focus on, such as transparency, governance, and other issues, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I also it was great to work with Munira and Antonio and the ADBI team. So thank you for all the input and the ideas that we had going through this. First, I want to just address that question around why did we pick what we picked, and that was a hard one because it is enormous, obviously, and we've just come from a session, or I just went to the session on where we were talking about nuclear non-proliferation and how important that is, and that we sort of set that aside because that is such a specialised area, and there are experts in that room over there talking about that. So what we sort of did was we said, let's think about what do we need the globe to be like to reduce the probability of conflict, to reduce that likelihood, and think about stability and governance as a means to reducing the likelihood of conflict. And so if you think about those things, one, make it costly, make conflict costly. That's not the only thing, obviously, but what do you do in terms of international cooperation that makes conflict costly? It's about integration. It's about integration of economies, and it's about building the cooperation of economies. Next thing is reduce misinformation so that people are less likely to make mistakes and not realise the consequences of what they do. That's about building networks of communication and keeping that communication alive at all sorts of levels across government, and that includes civil society, and we've had, the scientific community. You think about all the little C, S, U, all the different acronyms we've got in front of 7, and they're all areas where that cooperation, getting that communication, reducing misinformation is really important. And then the third thing is actually make it unpopular, so make it politically unpopular. And Munir has touched on this issue. We need they to be seen as us. And what I mean by that is we need, rather than the othering, which populism tends to do, the reach for nationalism as a sort of an excuse for government not to be delivering to their people, to try and get people behind them. Why do you need more of an autocratic governance? Because there are risks out there and we'll protect you from them. And what we need instead is to focus on building the bridging capital. And so there's a nice analogy in the whole sort of social capital literature, which talks about bonding capital and bridging capital. And bonding capital is working with like-mindeds. It's your inside group and strengthening the relationships with your inside group. And we see a lot of that going on. And that's the sort of the plurilateral problem as well, rather than the multilateral issue. And so what we really need to do is actually be focusing on bridging capital and asking that question is, if what we're doing that sort of strengthens our in-group, is that eroding our relationships with our other groups? And so how can we build that bridging capital? So that was a kind of an overarching theme to say, what are the activities that we could be recommending that the G7 take forward and work with the G20 on that are going to build those relationships, build that bridging capital? And so what we really came down to was 3 areas. And Antonio's going to talk about the one about really thinking about how do we revamp the 10 principles of the Washington Consensus. What do we need to have that accompanies them, that actually makes, sort of globalisation and market economics return as a driver of development and growth? So there's that issue, and Task Force 1 touched on some of those issues as well. The second area is really think about very conscious bridge building approaches to what are sort of global problems and common problems. And we can all agree we've got a common problem in pandemic preparedness, in disaster preparedness, in things like that. But what are actions you can take where you can start building those relationships? And then the third one was really thinking about how do we tackle that kind of us and them problem, and how do we get countries to sort of see within their own country as well as across countries that they've got to start breaking down those us and them issues. So one of the themes that I think has come up across today, and I think is also reflected very much in our issues paper, is that that idea of capitalism and democracy being hand in hand, and the only way to sort of run a global economic system and a global political system is that. And there are different ways. And so it's about moving away from sort of saying you're with us as liberal democratic values or you're against us, and in fact say, what are all the areas of commonality where we've got that common interest? And so when we're talking about things you can do that really sort of frame it around prevention, preparedness and response, the PPR, which is just such a nice way, and you can put that onto so many issues, and you can think about the actions that you need to do, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on pandemic preparedness, whether it's on digital risks that are coming out, and think about research cooperation, data sharing, technology sharing, expertise sharing, and resource sharing. And those are the areas that if we think about those sorts of things, what do we need to do? One is financing, and financing is always really important, but it's not just financing, it's also about a lot of coordination on regulatory issues. And so this one of our policy briefs, which was the digital equivalent to the IPCC, it says digital poses a lot of risks. And so we need to have a research community that is working across countries to actually identify what those risks are and work out strategies for managing those risks. Let's not do what we did in climate change and say, let's leave it till the science till we're finally convinced that there is a problem because it's hitting us in the face, and actually sort of be preemptive on this and think about how to do that and do it in a cooperative way. So that's one of the policy briefs, and why we chose that one, because it really dealt with a very, very unique problem in a very concrete way for suggesting things. And then the third area is really sort of how do we reverse some of these trends on political polarisation, nationalisation and othering. And it's really saying to the G7, be models. So you've got problems at home. You know, good governance takes constant effort and work. And so it's not just about the international institutions, you have to have good domestic institutions as well. You have to sort of reverse some of the trends we've seen in decline in transparency in government decision making, with inclusion in service delivery, respect for differences in economies rather than building them up. But so for the G7 countries to make commitments to take steps towards doing those sorts of things, as if they want to be role models, then they need to. And then that feeds nicely into the sort of areas on international cooperation that our policy briefs also looked at, that we chose because they looked at those things. One was very much metrics on government accountability and new metrics for performance. So rethinking about how you evaluate what governments do and what they deliver and how they cooperate. Another was involving women in meaningful ways, particularly in peace building activities. And another was on disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration approach that has been proposed and is sitting there, but really just needs to be implemented through the UN system. And so they were policy briefs that we thought got to those issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe just one quick question, because in your career you have been in research, you were also been in government, and how would you look at the at that moment at the interaction between think tanks, research, and government, such as what the T7 Japan is trying to achieve? I push a little bit further the interaction, not just presenting a couple of ideas, take it or leave it, but questioning a bit more how leadership can be infused by different sources of information, different ways to look at a problem, not just in a one-sided manner.
That's always, it varies very much by countries. I mean, you have the US with a system where you have people moving in and out of academia into government, and so you have that flow. Australia, the flow is much less. Japan, I think the professor will be able to tell us, but I think that flow is not quite so strong either. And so obviously that's increasing that flow between academia and government jobs is actually a really powerful thing to get that information. And it's also finding headspace within governments to actually appreciate that expertise and to bring that into their decision making. And so again, that takes conscious effort on, we want good government. What do we do to get good government? Evaluation of programs comes up again and again. we have whole development programs. Evaluation is stronger in development than almost any other area because for some reason governments are held much more accountable for an official development assistance dollar than they are for other money that they spend. And so there is all this evaluation out there, but how do we put the pressure on government to actually use that evidence and information? And that's where ADBI does such a good job, bringing that to the fore. And sometimes it's water dripping on stone, but water dripping enough does eventually erode the stone. So it's worthwhile keeping going.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Antonio, you have been very active in the T7, but you have also been very active not long ago, right after the peak of the COVID pandemic in the T20 Italy, in times where the lines were a bit blurred, whether we would be convening physically or online or a little bit of both, and we didn't know exactly what it was to be reconvening physically again, right? I remember for the T20 summit in Milano. So with this in mind, please share your thoughts and experience about the and your views about the conclusions of the task force, and maybe how the economy is playing an important role and maybe a positive role in ensuring that global governance is still floating while there are a number of threats to be addressed. The floor is yours, Antonio.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, and thank you, of course, to ADBI and Dean Sonobe-san for having me today. Well, before you asked what were the biggest challenges we had when covering this, very vast array of issues of our task force. When it comes to the economic part, the biggest challenges for us was to trying to put together different points of view of what globalization, the reform of globalization should look like. Because, of course, coming from a mature economy, Italy, coming from West, we might have, our recipes also as, democracies, while coming from, China, from other countries which are members of the G20, the recipes could be different. So our attempt and our task was also to try to, just draw some conclusions which are not value-based. I mean, we know that if we really want to make progress in the context of the G20, we should, also draft some proposals, down-to-earth proposals, which are not only good for fully fledged democracies, but also for illiberal democracies or non-democratic governments. So this was, the biggest challenge, trying to, really think of proposals, down-to-earth proposals, which are not necessarily value-driven, which was, really a big task for us. So having this in mind, we all know that globalization is at a turning point, and not necessarily at a good turning point. We know that, there is a concrete risk for a fragmented world economy, probably not as fragmented as it was in the Cold War. Still, I mean, this is a real risk. So we need to revise, the Washington Consensus, the Bretton Woods institutions, and what has been set basically by Western countries to drive globalization. But in doing so, of course, we have to recognize what is, good in the Washington Consensus, in the Bretton Woods institutions, because, we experienced it, and we have to remember that unprecedented growth levels, we experienced an unprecedented reduction of poverty, thanks to the international cooperation, and thanks also to this Western-led, let's say, institutions and global rules. But having said so, we must recognize also the drawbacks of the globalization as we know it, which means rising inequalities, and not only in developing countries, also in mature economies, which means also the side effects, if you want to call it this way euphemistically, of economic growth, which is the environmental part, of course, of all these, and which is, of course, also the need for having a fairer trade with better participation of all the actors around the world. So these are the biggest challenge, and this is something that we have to do in any case, because what is the risk that we are running if we do not intervene? The risk is the continued rise of populism and nationalism in democratic and non-democratic countries, and then the risk really of the end of globalization and the rise of a fragmented international economy. So now let's go very quickly to the proposals that we introduced, and we based our proposals on especially the most important economic actors in the world, which are multinationals and private enterprises, the biggest one, of course, irrespective of the ownership. So it could be both private companies and state-owned enterprises, which of course the case for many Chinese companies, for instance. So what are the proposals that we made, having in mind all the drawbacks of the Washington Consensus and the need to expand the principles of the Washington Consensus? So first, these big firms should pay resource rent taxes on natural resources that they consume. In many countries, it is already the case. It's not a general rule. It should be applied to any country. Second, these big companies should pay domestic taxes to fund the public services they use, including the services that support the education and health of their labor force. They cannot simply retain these profits. They have to share because they benefited from these public services, from these public goods to some extent. They should share the upside from their economic activity with the government, where they seek to use the government resources to insure themselves against losses. This is particularly important when it comes to financial stability. Multinationals enjoy financial stability, of course, because they can only flourish if there is financial stability. So it means that it is an asset from them. They should contribute to financial stability. This is not something, which is a dream. This is something which is very concrete, for instance, inside the European Union, in which there are, some schemes through which banks, for instance, contribute to a common guarantee, okay, if, a financial distress emerge. So this is a model which could be, to some extent, be replicated also at the global level. So much more in concrete terms, what are the actions to be implemented? Again, our point was, let's fly down, let's be, on the topic and let's make down-to-earth proposals. First action, concrete action, ensure that firms pay taxes mostly in the locations where they undertake production and generate revenue. This is something which is already underway. The OECD already is working, and we know that some, important results were achieved during the Saudi presidency first, then during the Italian presidency first, when it comes to taxation of multinationals. Much more has to be done. It still has to be fully implemented, especially the pillar 2 of these measures. But I mean, this is something on which we still have to build upon. Then, introducing minimum standards for taxation of resource rents and the publication of the tax paid by foreign and large domestic firms to improve transparency and accountability. So again, if you as a company are, using natural resources, you should be considered, accountable for this use, and in a very transparent way, and by also publishing, in a very, again, transparent way, what has been done in the exploitation that has been done, you should be kept responsible and pay for this. Last but not least, the establishment of common standards for measuring negative externalities at firm and country level, and this would provide a foundation for establishing a minimum tax the firms pay for the damage they cause. When this damage is beyond country borders, the tax could be used to fund a loss and damage fund, We know that last year at the COP26, this fund was created in a very bizarre way because finally we have this fund, but the tricky part of it is that we don't know the size of this fund, what is it for, and who is paying for it. So we don't know anything about it. So this is one idea on the way through which we could, put some money in this fund. So the bottom line, and I close here, is not really to raise taxes, to put other taxes on multinationals and big firms. But, the bottom line of our work was to create a context in which the right incentives are sent to big companies. The right incentives go into the direction of letting companies do what they are supposed to do, which is increase productivity, instead of being rent-seeking companies. So this is, I think, the right way, our point of view, of course, I shared with my colleagues, to put the problem down to earth, concrete proposals, and not necessarily a value-driven approach.
Thank you very much.
If I may just add, this number should be of interest to the audience. Even in US, concentration of national income to the top 1% in 1980 was 10%. In 2021, it's 20%. Yeah. So that sort of tells you the sort of facts on the ground. So I thought I might as well share this number with you. So it very goes close with what Antonio is saying, that it's not to penalize or particularly rent-seeking, but to make the limited use of limited resources in a more efficient fashion, so that end of the day, the general social welfare services for common people, that remains deliverable. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Said. And just one coming to that as well for Antonio, one additional question is whether at this moment, and we have heard in multiple occasions since this morning that the fiscal situation or the fiscal justice situation and other economic parameters in G7 countries were not that brilliant at the moment, right? So sometimes we tend to overemphasize there's the G7 that should be healthy, wealthy, and so on, and the rest of the developing countries that should be struggling with a number of challenges. The reality is a bit different. But however, when considering such sort of macroeconomic responses, precisely would you see still a huge difference between solutions that could apply or be driven by G7 countries and by others, or do you think that things are sort of being equalized one way or another? What is the vision that you would like to share after sort of circulating into those matters in the past months?
Since we are among friends, let's be very frank. I mean, most of these, policy recommendations that we made are at least partially in place in some countries, okay? And most of them, again, we are just among friends, are democracies. The point is that, again, when we talk about the G20, I mean, members are not necessarily democracies. So the process cannot be value-driven, as I said at the beginning, but it has to be, concrete proposals. This is the way in which also the G7 should try to build consensus for, a global consensus to be found in the G20. So with concrete proposals in which, as also Jenny said, do your part as G7 inside your country, and you can lead by example in a way. The others will follow, but just because you are really facing common challenges, not because you are the leader, you are supposed to be the leader, which is not the case, it should not be the case. So if this is the way of proceeding, I think that the link between the G7 and the G20 is a good one. If I may add only one thing, and one thing on which we should, I think, discuss a lot, is about also the validity of the rules that we have today. We have to remember that they were created by the West, whether we like it or not. When we talk about revising these rules, because, of course, much more room should be given to the global south. The question, and I have no answer for that, but I don't hear any answer, is replaced by what? There is no consensus in the global south about the replacement of those rules. There is the feeling that there is a need for that, but there is no response on what is the alternative. And this, I think, is something on which the Think20 and the Think7 also over the next year should investigate.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Jenny, please.
Can I just add to,
Yeah.
add to that? I mean, one of the reasons you need to have the G7 really take the lead on this is because most of the companies are G7 companies. And so they're the ones who'll face that pushback from their multilaterals, you know, multinational companies who don't want the rules to change. They want to be able to do whatever they're able to do. They want to play countries off against each other. You know, with lower corporate tax rates here, they want to play those games. And so we actually will take the government to sort of say, no, we're enforcing this on you because you happen to be sort of our companies. So that's one of the reasons why it has to be a leadership of a G7 to actually get these sorts of rules through. Because the Washington Consensus, which was largely data-based, it failed partly because in some countries, it worked in many countries and worked really, really well to deliver economic growth and development. But in some countries, they didn't have the preconditions that were needed. They didn't have the governance structures that were in place. They didn't have the foundations of law and order. And so some of the issues paper goes to some of those issues of what are those preconditions look like? How do you get governments to start delivering services and be held accountable for the services that they deliver? And so it's sort of a combination of things. It's sort of, none of these will solve the problem in themselves, but all of them will work together towards starting to solve some problems.
Thank you very much. Yoichi Mine, you are the executive director of JICA, which is a major player, not only in Asia, but also globally, right, regarding development, bilateral, multilateral development and development support. So and your agency is working typically through projects, but also in countries, and also having a broad strategy, right? So you were listening very carefully to the different findings and also difficulties or challenges that were addressed by the co-chairs of the task force, and also about something that is just beneath the surface and sometimes is completely underestimated, but was very well expressed in the issue paper. And Antonio, thank you for putting that back onto the table. That is the role of a number of non-state actors, starting with multinational companies, right? Who can follow or not sometimes the rules, or anticipate or build them to their own advantage, etc. And you're right to remind us that a number of such multinational companies, they are still largely hosted or headquartered in G7 countries, right? So that is really part of that equation. So, Dr. Mine, your I would say your vision, or if you have any comments on the main arguments that were put on the table, or your vision as one also of the champion through JICA of the notion of human security and how to reinforce human security in times of changes, transformations, volatilities, uncertainties. The floor is yours, and thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Nicola. Could you show the PowerPoint? Okay. Actually, I'm not the director of JICA, but the JICA Research Institute. So JICA is actually not the
Research Institute. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah. JICA is not collecting tax, but a professional of spending money in concrete projects in the field. So my talk is based on the knowledge accumulated in the such operations. I wanted to give casual talk, but I opted for the PowerPoint presentation. It's a bit not very cool, but I wanted to promote something of my institute in some bit more systematic way. So let me begin by giving citation. It's a text of the Mahbubul Haq, is a Pakistani economist. And human security is not a concern with weapons, it's a concern with human dignity. In the last analysis, it is a child who did not die, a disease that did not spread, an ethnic tension that did not explode, a dissident who was not silenced, a human spirit that was not crushed. A powerful revolutionary idea, the emerging concept of human security forces a new morality on all of us through a perception of common threats to our very survival. So I think this captures very well the spirit of human security. So Mahbubul Haq is a very good friend of the Indian economist Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen and a Japanese lady, Madame Sadako Ogata, she was the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and they took up the idea of human security, which was a brainchild of Mahbubul Haq. And then, this is Madame Ogata. So my institute is actually Ogata Research Institute. It's quite an enormous legacy. And my institute combines the practical development practice and academic research from the overarching perspective of human security idea. So let me introduce this. Actually, I didn't write any paper for this panel, but instead I want to present this report. And actually, the human security today, it's JICA's report. This is what is important is this is periodical. This is number one. So this was edited by my predecessor, Professor Takahara. Thank you very much. You're sitting there. So then early next year, we're going to publish number 2. So maybe number 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 100, as long as human insecurity continues. So I think this is shows the Japan's or JICA's commitment to the idea of human security. So we are publishing the report, Japanese and English versions, and it's downloadable from the JICA's website. And talking about human security, the traditional security agenda is a national security, state security, protecting nation's security against military aggression, typically by fascist regime and autocratic regime. But as we have discussed quite a lot in the conference, we also face so-called non-traditional security issues. It's a non-military threats and environmental, energy security issues, and food, health, economy, violent conflict, etc. And all threats are interconnected. And here comes the new and a bit controversial idea of security. Security of individuals and communities matter. So this is human security. And if we use security studies terminology, this is to shift the referent object of security from the state to individuals. So theoretically, this is quite unsettling, but also potentially very, very revolutionary idea. Okay, and but if we think from the individual human persons and communities, also we see a lot of multiplicity of security providers, not just nation state. The government is important, but not only government, but also business enterprises, civil society, religious communities, municipalities, schools, friends, even family. These are all security providers for living persons. And this multiplicity requires greater coordination and cooperation, among those stakeholders and actors. So this is why UNDP released a new special report on human security last year, or almost the same time as the JICA produced our first report. So in the UNDP presented the concept of solidarity, underscored the importance of solidarity across sectors and across national borders and also beyond the generations to secure human security for individuals. Okay, so this is the front page of the UNDP report that entitled "New Threats to Human Security in the Anthropocene: Demanding Greater Solidarity." And actually, just yesterday, UNDP and JICA co-hosted an event launching our these two reports by JICA and this UNDP's report and UNDP's new Human Development Report. And this is quite interesting chart. This shows the incremental growth of human development indicators. It's a combination of the income and educational attainments and also health. So, but for the first time, since 1990, in 2020 and 21, you can see this is the first decrease in human development indicator is globally measured. So, human security threats are not only diverse, but also quite sudden, abrupt. So we never expected this, spread of this pandemic, and almost nobody expected exactly the Ukraine wars, some 4 years ago. So it's quite sudden, and this is a kind of reaction to the very interesting issue paper you prepared. So this is a graphic illustration of the human security. The human development is normative path of human development is quite incremental, some gradual increase in income and also health and education. But the actual path of human development is always ups and downs and ups and downs. It's exactly like human life. Our life is like this, sometimes losing jobs and maybe it's family members, and sometimes, failure of life is a lot of different kind of adversity. But sometimes the children come to see me, is a happiness, well-being, and also the downturn. So this is human life. The, global human development is also like this, ups and downs and ups and downs. So prevention, preparedness, and our response and gradual recovery. So this is quite a dynamic process. So human security is all about this, dynamics and learning lessons from the past experience. Okay, so we underscore the importance of resilience. Okay, and then human security for what? People say this is a freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity. So respecting dignity is quite important. So this is a citation from the Nobel Prize economists Banerjee and Duflo from their recent book. So the extreme poor are robbed of their dignity and their agency. They are made to understand that they should be grateful for help even when they don't particularly want it. The deep disregard for the human dignity of the poor is endemic in the social protection system, and to some extent global development cooperation as well, unfortunately. So the dignity matters. Okay, so, sorry, almost the end of my presentation. So the state security is important, of course, but also the human security is important. Japanese government is going to release a development cooperation charter, which is now under revision. So I was a member of advisory panel. So maybe a few months later, they will release the new charter. So in this new charter, will feature both Japan's national interest and global human security. So I think this is a wise decision. You know, it's a kind of two wheels of the same vehicle. So national security is important, but also the non-state actors is expected to play a bigger role, greater role, in securing, security for individuals. And finally, I'm not representing JICA, but this is my personal opinion. So finally, this is the last slide. G7, G20 are playing more and more important roles, but it's still not based on the international laws, international treaties. So maybe the United Nations reform is also important. So I sometimes think the United Nations Security Council, I think the representation of the global south should be, strengthened. The membership is quite important, but at the same time, quantitatively, I think the UN Security Council could be renamed Human Security Council. So to make it, the address as their formal mandate, address the, non-traditional security issues, multiple threats, and also make Council or United Nations system to collaborate, fully with non-state actors. It's not representing the JICA's position, but my opinion. Okay, thank you very much. This is the end of my slide.
Thank you very much. And this is also quite interesting and complementary. And I've got one simple question, because around the notion of human security in the past months or after it was issued, there have always been some discussions and some debates, right, about how to frame it, and then also about whether it is too human-centered in times where there are a number of natural factors, environmental preservation, biodiversity, and other ecosystem parameters which are maybe damaged by human, but which human should not consider to be superior of, etc. In terms of long time livelihoods. The question would be like this: would you say that this notion of human security would be fit better in a G7 perspective, or could it apply also with a wider angle at a G20 perspective? And I think it was both Said in the beginning and Antonio were also referring to kind of values which are also attached to a number of concepts, or is it aiming to be universal? So about this positioning of human security alongside current debates about the legitimacy of that space of discussions. The floor is yours.
The first question is about the human-centeredness, and Mahbub Haq, in around the same part of the text, and he also said, great religions in the world contain some message about the eventual punishment. Okay, so but at the same time, the transformation, takes place because of this fear for human survival. Okay, it can be quite ambiguous, but anyway, so the human security is not necessarily human-centered. This is, why human security? Because now human survival is in question, as a human race is now in danger. So this is quite urgent question for us. So this is why human security. And also at the same time, and you also talked about the universal application and also the global south and G7, G20. And I think human security is context specific, but also I think is very, very relevant to the countries in the south. Especially because in so-called fragile states, and we know all about the tragedy in the Sudan now, but in such a fragile conditions, people survive because of their security providers. other than nation states, like families and clans and religious groups and sometimes their own private businesses. They survive because of these security providers. So I think it is quite important for the northern countries to give support to the such lively security providers in the southern countries. Yes, but at the same time, these may face some reaction. So sovereignty is important. So I think nation building is quite important because a nation state government is also a security provider. So I think we should do both for the security.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much. Any comment from you, Jenny, Antonio, or Said on those points, and especially the last articulation, sovereignty, human security?
We actually used the term comprehensive security, which in some ways is very similar to the term human security, the way it's used here, but we saw it as sort of a useful way of thinking about it because it then nests national security and then in individuals' security within the country and freedom, and then within a household, freedom from domestic violence and things. So you've got those layers of kind of physical security, I suppose you could say. Then you've got economic security, and then you've got the sort of human security, which is being able to get an education, having enough to eat, feeling like that there's a future for you, that you'll have a livelihood in the future and you'll be able to form a family and you'll be able to have freedom of association, things like that. So they're kind of nested, and you can see you can have national security and not have the others. You can have, so it's sort of, it's very hard to get real human security unless you've got all the others, right? So there would always be some people, if you've got domestic violence, who are excluded from that security sort of coverage. So that's the way we structured it, so that it's sort of a nested thing.
Yeah.
And to get to real human security, you need all of it.
Thank you very much. Syed?
Actually, I don't know whether you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. I mean, it's very much applicable to the concept of security. When we talk about security, if we're looking at the developing global south, what happens? The people who are struggling to meet day's need, to them security starts with being able to feed themselves. Number one. Move to the next level. The next level is what? Once you're fed, you have your social needs. The need to be loved, the need to belongingness. Then you move to the next level. So when we look at security, at times in our world of think tanks and intellectual exercise, we get very lost in the quagmire of politics, economy, security, but the fundamentals are much more simple than the complex thing we always talk about. Then what happens? When people have that, they go for self-esteem needs, self-actualization needs. One leads to the other. I'll give a simple number. There's a global peace index which measures stability and peace in the regions. And since 2008, it's going down. And in 2021, the simple economic cost of violence was an astounding number, $16 to $17 trillion, or almost 10 to 11% of global GDP, which boiled down to per person $2,100. So these are very research. The reason why I'm drawing this attention, politics, economy, security is a complex triangle. It's very difficult to isolate one from the another. Our challenge is to find a middle path. And if you look at the T20 ambassador Chinoy, he was pushing very hard on the developing global south. And I could understand from where he's coming, because he's trying to represent a huge portion of population beyond G7 who are struggling to meet those needs. Now, we know what's happening even in COP. We have had a pledge of $100 billion, 2009, nothing has happened. We have had talk about loss and damage fund, COP27, nobody has stepped in. The reason I'm pushing the boundaries, it is a complex thing, and for the G7, G20 to come together, because this was one of the things we were given responsibility, it has to start from a very, very low level of meeting the food needs, health needs, then move to the upward. But what we tend to do by putting all this together, somewhere we get lost. And then we have these deep divisions. South doesn't want to talk about Ukraine war, is not interested to talk about conflicts, while many of the developed countries, these fundamentally, rightly so, affects global peace and security. So we have to find a common middle ground where people's survival are addressed, and also not at the expense of big geopolitics happening, whether it's Ukraine war or authoritarian regime, so on and so forth. It's complex. It's not that easy. The challenge is how do we carve out a middle path, minimum, where these two groups or group of nations come together. That would be my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes left before wrapping the session. In case there is any note or any remark from the floor, any thought? Yes, one here. Any other one? Not at this moment. So please introduce yourself briefly and also be short, concise.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Hannah Alexis Asilo. I'm from the Philippines. And my question is actually on security connected to mining. In a setting where a country is rich in natural resources, specifically minerals, but don't have the technology or resources to mine these resources, so the country encourages foreign firms to mine the minerals, giving these firms incentives such as political rights, full ownership of land, and tax holidays. However, there are environmental and social problems which arise, such as displacing farmer and indigenous people, and destroy the ecosystem due to the spilled mine tailings and toxic mine waste. In this context, how should we complement state security or economic security with human security at the community, national, and international levels?
Thank you very much. It's a nice question. If you allow me, I might extend it also for the sake of closing our discussion with another aspect which is linked to that, is about securing the provision of rare minerals, for example, and how sometimes it is difficult to balance both sustainability and sustainable I would say norms and ESG, and get access to those rare minerals and promote sustainability throughout the whole supply and value chain. So, any final thought on such an aspect of also security, sovereignty, and sustainability?
Well, again, let's be very frank. I mean, if there is a foreign company going to another country, basically exploiting natural resources, there is a problem of the government which is allowing it. Of course, there could be an international organization, just pointing the finger and saying it's wrong. It's very difficult for international organization to be so powerful, to stop that behavior. This is, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, the reality. What the international system could do, international organization could do, is to at least have agreements on minimum standards to be followed by any company. So even if it's a foreign company or a domestic company exploiting national resources, they should be kept accountable for that. There should be a reporting on what they are doing, and they should pay at least a minimum tax. Something which, has already been done by international organizations, by the OECD is working on this, on implementing, a minimum tax. And that is the right direction, because now we are talking about, how beautiful is international cooperation, G7, G20, but basically when we speak to the men in the street, they have no idea of what we are talking about. Just because they don't feel the ability of those international organizations to deliver. And this is the biggest challenges for all of us, revising institutions with one thing, which is, the main mission, increasing their ability to deliver. But in doing so, and I close here, we have to be very sincere. I mean, when we talk about, for instance, expanding, enlarging the G20, I personally agree, we don't have to make the same mistake, which is not a mistake, but of the UN General Assembly, in which there's one country, one vote. Unfortunately, we all know that in international relations, the General Assembly of the United Nations is not a powerful body. So, of course, we have to try to make the G20 more democratic, for instance, with rotating representation. The African Union should be represented, but we don't have to run the risk of doing so to the extent that we will decrease the ability to deliver of the G20 of any other international organization, because at the end of the day, the ability to deliver is the only thing that matters.
I think could be the last word, if you agree, of this panel discussion. Thank you so much. You will be able to discuss with the speakers in the sides and during the dinner time. So unfortunately we cannot take any more remarks or questions. But thank you again very much. It was a fruitful exchange and discussion, and congratulations again for taking the lead on peace, security, and global governance as part of the T7 Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.